This presentation today is changing gears, the women who redefined what racing could be. So we're going to go through about 130 years of motorsport history to kind of talk about some of the big figures who have changed racing. We'll start with our table of contents. So I've kind of split the history of women in racing up into three distinct eras. We've got the early groundbreakers, which were early 1900s all the way to just after post-war. Post-war pilots, which is the late 1940s to the 1980s. And then we've got the modern trailblazers, so these women who last 20, 30 years have been involved in racing. And then we'll take a little look at the future to see what it is that women can do now. For my little introduction for myself, you've got the spiel already, but I am Elizabeth Blackstock. I'm an award-winning motorsport historian and author. I have over a decade of experience covering forms of motorsport, including Formula One, for various publications like Planet F1, Jalopnik, The Road Rat, The Drive, Donut Media, Road and Track, all kinds of the goods. I have a podcast called Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, which digs into the forgotten scandals and tragedies in motorsport history that folks tend to forget. I've co-authored a book called Racing with Rich Energy, which digs into the wild history of Rich Energy, the energy drink company that sponsored Haas F1 in a multi-million-dollar sponsorship despite having less than $1,000 in the bank. And I also have a cooking project that I brought back this year called Grand Prix Gastronomy, where I make regionally representative dishes for every Formula One race, which I'm very excited about. I'm going shopping after this to get stuff for ramen. So one of my big specialties, though, is women in motorsport. I love to know more about the ways that women have been involved. And the thing is that women have always been involved in cars. They've always been involved in racing. All the way back in 1888, Bertha Benz up there on her Benz carriage, self-propelled carriage, her husband Carl Benz was one of the first men to patent the vehicle as we would know it today, the self-propelled carriage. She completed the first long-distance road trip behind a car. She was his wife. Carl told her, please do not drive this. It is unreliable, it is a little rickety. She got behind the wheel anyway. She drove about 60 miles to her mother's house. It's known as the first long-distance road trip in history. A decade later, over in France, Helen van Zuylen became the first woman to enter a race and the first woman to receive a driver's license. And in the United States, in 1909, Alice Hoyler Ramsey, a 22-year-old housewife and mother, completed the first coast-to-coast road trip made by a woman in the United States. This is before we had any roads that crossed the country. There were really no maps at this time. She did this with her two sisters-in-law and her best friend. None of them could drive. It was all up to Alice, and it took them about 2 months to complete that whole journey. But now that I have said women have always raced, I have to add a little caveat, because while women have always been behind the wheel of cars, there have been a lot of factors that have prevented them from being accepted in the same way as their male competitors. Those things are both societal and they're practical, and I want to start by talking about kind of the practical difficulties women faced, because I think those are very easy to forget about. First and foremost, those early cars were hard to drive. They were very difficult, and not only to drive, but to start. As you watch this gentleman, he has to crank start the motor. He has to put a wrench into the front and physically start the engine. This is physically demanding. It's not very easy. And at the same time, engines were prone to kickback, so you could actually damage your hands, wrists, and face in the process of trying to get your car started. If you did manage to start that car, you were not getting behind the wheel, you were getting behind a tiller. So a big, long stick, basically, that this is what you use to steer. And your body, your upper body strength is basically what you use to steer, because there was no power steering. You'll see there's very little suspension as well. On the dirty, rutted roads of the time, you were feeling every single bump, so it was not a comfortable experience. It's also very loud. You're exposed to the elements. And if you were a woman in the early 1900s, we're not in the era of hoop skirts anymore, but we're certainly not in an era of easeful movement based on the clothes you're supposed to wear. We're talking corsets, layers and layers of skirts. This could weigh as much as a small child. Delicate fabrics, laces, elaborate hairdos, hats that you had to wear out, gloves. You weren't supposed to get dirty. You weren't supposed to kind of be around in these things. So these clothes keep you restricted on what kind of movement you can do. If you've ever been to prom or quinceañera or wedding where you've had to help shove someone's dress into a car, this is what they would have been doing every single time a woman got behind the wheel. Now, clothing is part of a societal factor, and that's what I'd like to talk about next. There were a lot of pushbacks against women getting behind the wheel. The men in their lives often assumed that they should be under their dominion. They had certain rights, but were generally expected to be kept at home, taking care of the family, raising children. It wasn't appropriate for a woman to travel by herself, and the automobile opened up that possibility of you being able to go travel long distances alone. That meant that women started to be around in public places, public squares, law offices, universities. They're wanting to have a little more access to everyday life. And there was a vested interest from the ruling classes at the time, wherever you were living, in making sure that those women kind of stayed in their specific socially acceptable place. And to illustrate just how restrictive Western society was, we need to look at the development of kind of the ways cars are powered. Electric vehicles were actually invented before the combustion engine. You could had self-propelled electric-powered vehicles in the 1830s before we had combustion engines. Now, they were never particularly popular, and a big reason for that was because they were marketed to women. You did not need to crank start the engine the way that you had to with a combustion engine. You mostly just needed to kind of get in. So it's cleaner, it's quieter, it's less physically demanding. Men would have benefited from this too, but the marketing aimed this toward higher class women. We have the be patriotic, buy an electric vehicle kind of plea here for the women involved in Detroit. The associations became so strong between femininity and electrification that it stopped being a thing. We stopped producing electric vehicles. Now, again, at this time, battery technology wasn't great, couldn't travel very fast or far, but you weren't really doing much fast or far in a combustion engine as well. There were limitations on everything. But this is just kind of one example of this way that society influenced the direction of the automobile. The automobile went through a lot of early development, all the way up through World War I. World War I brought with it kind of a standardization of technology. For the first time, you had assembly lines producing cars that were mostly the same, so that it was easy for you to get in and out of the wheel, particularly on the battleground. It was big in replacing the millions and millions of horses and donkeys that were killed every year in war at this time. It also allowed women to get behind the wheel because women were often tasked with being ambulance drivers. So now we've got more cars around. Women are getting some more rights. They're kind of evolving socially. And this is the era in which we're going to talk about our first two pioneers. The first one being Camille du Gast. Now, Camille du Gast was born to a wealthy family in Paris in 1868. And she was raised as a tomboy in a time when that was not quite common. Her family was wealthy. She was raised with an education. She was raised to travel. And she was more than anything encouraged to be physically active in a way that many of her more humble peers may not have been. When she was 22 years old, she continued to grow in this space because she married a fella named Jules Crespin. Jules Crespin was heir to a fortune. His father had created one of the first major department stores in Paris, and he was just as much an adventurer as his wife Camille. Not only that, but he encouraged her to continue doing these sporting activities, shooting, tobogganing, hot air ballooning, whatever she wanted to do. He just had one request. She not use his surname because he did not want these kind of exploits to be confused with publicity stunts for the department store. Unfortunately, he passed away after just 6 years of marriage. He left Camille behind with a fortune, a young daughter, plenty of race cars, and one of the first driver's licenses of the era. We know that Camille first found an interest in racing in around 1900. She went to something called the Gordon Bennett Cup. This was a 350-mile race that took place between two different cities in France. She saw this and she thought, I can do this. I want to do this. Now, these early races are a lot different than what we would expect today. They're on open public roads. They're not shutting these down for the race to take place. They're really just kind of whoever ends up in the shortest elapsed period of time will be the winner. Cars leave one at a time, and eventually you'll end up at the end of this route. Now, Camille thought this is fascinating. She was not deterred by the fact that it took over 9 hours for this 350-mile race to be completed. She was going to be involved. There we go. So, in 1901, she enters her first race, which is a rally from Paris to Berlin. She had a 20-horsepower car. She was one of 110 entrants. And she was also one of about 40 cars to finish the race. She finished 33rd. So even finishing at that point, pretty big deal, especially for a distance that large. And she managed to do so. The next race she competed in was not until 1903, the Paris to Madrid rally. And this race would unfortunately go on to be one of the most infamous in motorsport history. Camille was one of over 250 entrants for this race. She was scored as high as 6th place in the running order at one point. But things started to fall apart. As the cars left Versailles, one by one, there was a problem. It hadn't rained in France in weeks, and there was no wind, so the cars are kicking up dust, and the dust isn't going anywhere. It's just settling in the roadway. Not only can the drivers not see, but neither can the spectators. The spectators start to get closer and closer to the road. They start to get closer to the cars. We start to have incidents where the drivers, they can't see these spectators, and they're going to crash into them. We had multiple fatalities in that race from that alone. We also had various instances of other deaths, drivers crashing because they were trying to avoid dogs. There was one team that crashed. They chose to crash into a house because they arrived at a train crossing and found a train actively going across those tracks. They had nowhere to go but into this house. Many, many people were killed. Camille was not involved in any of these accidents, unless you count the fact that she stopped her car at one point to help a fellow competitor. His car had flipped and overturned on him. His name was Phil Stead, and she is credited with helping save his life by helping free him from under that car. By doing so, she sacrificed that 6th place running position for 77th. The race was ended early. That is where she was classified. And unfortunately, there was a fierce outcry against motorsport just in general at this point. People were concerned that this form of motorsport, this racing, was just going to be too dangerous. But the automakers were really invested in this. They liked the fact that they were able to push their cars to the limit. They liked the fact that they could do it on open roads where people could see so that they could, it's just basically free marketing. You go out there and then you can buy that car you've just seen. So they had to make a call. They had to do something. They're not going to ban racing. So they banned women from racing. Camille was the only woman in that race. She had nothing to do with any of the incidents. But they needed to be seen doing something, and that was what they did. This ended Camille's racing career prematurely. She did get into boat racing. Boat racing was a big deal at that point. She commissioned her own yacht to go racing, and in an Algiers to Toulon race, she actually was crowned the winner. They called her the Valkyrie of motorsport after that because a major storm came in and wiped out every single boat. Everyone was sunk. But Camille had made it the farthest before she was sunk, so she was declared winner after that. After all of this went on, she retires from active competition. She did several scientific tours in Morocco. She opened several charities, both for the welfare of animals and for helping people who were displaced by war. And she also survived a murder plot initiated by her daughter. We're going to skip ahead now to the 1930s and to a woman named Odette Seco. She was the first woman to race at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Now, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, we are seeing a change here in the motorsport space. We stopped doing these city-to-city races. They were too dangerous. Instead, we're closing down public roads and creating a loop that drivers are competing on for a full 24 hours. They did this, Grand Prix racing was the big form of racing at this time. Those races were only like 5 hours. Automakers wanted to show that they had the reliability to last even longer than that. So they created this 24-hour race where drivers swap in and out behind the wheel and compete twice around the clock. The first 7 years of Le Mans were all male, but in 1930, we had our first female competitors. Odette Seco and her friend Marguerite Marouz entered Marguerite's Bugatti T40 in the race. They really didn't have any racing experience. They had very little competitive experience kind of overall. And they managed to finish this race. Only 16 cars finished. They finished 7th of those 16. They did the whole 24 hours. They came back the next year, unfortunately were disqualified. Marguerite decides after this she's done. She got racing out of her system, but Odette keeps going. Odette enters the race, and in the 1932 event, she joins up with a gentleman named Jean Sabiba, and the two of them finish 4th overall. This remains the best finish for a woman at the 24 Hours of Le Mans to this day. And just for context, 68 women in total have competed in this event. There's a period of 20 years where women were banned from competing between 1951 and 1971. We've had women almost every single year now, dating back to 2015 when there wasn't a woman on the grid. And the best finisher is still one of the first women to enter this race. However, women were in a precarious place in the racing world. We had more women than ever involved. Not a ton, but just enough to sequester those women into their own races. So Odette was no longer, after this point, really competing with any men. They were putting her in the Coupe de Dames races, or the Cup for women, and that was where she was competing. Thankfully, there were some major companies at this time, like Yaco Oil, a French oil company, that would sponsor these women to take part in rallies as well as these major record-breaking endurance runs. So in 1937, Yaco Oil crowns Odette Seco team captain of a group of 4 women who spend 10 days trying to break a series of records. During that entire time, they are swapping out, getting out of the wheel, handing it over to the next woman. And at that point, they set 25 international driving records for speed, for distance, for all kinds of things, both for women and for overall records as well. Unfortunately, then the onset of World War II kind of ended things here. Women were told they had to either go back to the home or start taking part in the war effort. And we don't have any records of what Odette did after the war. We know she still lived, we just don't believe she did any racing. And now that brings us to the intense shift that was World War II. It is a major understatement to say that this war changed the world, but I'm going to say it anyway. Millions of men were shipped off to war, where many of them were killed. But just because the men were gone did not mean the world stopped. Women needed to take care of the homes, the farms, the businesses, the children. They were at home kind of propping up the war effort to keep all the countries involved going. This gave them a little more agency, a little more independence. Many of them were working for a wage for the first time in their life. They were starting to get used to these kinds of roles. But that is not what the returning men wanted from them. These soldiers coming back from the war were surprised, to say the least, that these women that they had kind of spent their wartime dreaming of were more independent than they remembered them to be. And I don't want to say this to say that men are bad. If I was out there in the war witnessing horrors beyond my comprehension, the deaths of multiple friends, all sorts of destruction and violence, I would probably spend a lot of time dreaming about the quiet life I'm going to have at home as well. I'm going to be dreaming about my girlfriend who I want to make my wife, the job I'm going to come back to, all of the things I'm about to put behind me. But when these men came home, they found that the world had changed while they were gone. Their best girl, she probably had a job, maybe the job he would have wanted. She might have even had her own place to live. She's got calloused hands from working in the munitions factory. She's not the gentle wife to say that he was expecting. So we saw a lot of ideological clashes. We had women now in the motorsport space who are determined to compete because they have shown that they have the autonomy, independence, and grit to do so. And we have a lot of men who are pushing back on this and saying, no, actually, you can't race. We don't want you in these spheres. So there were certain bans that were enacted on women at this time. Other bans were lifted. It really depends on where you were in the world. But the first woman I want to talk about is Maria Teresa de Filippis. Now Maria, she is the first woman to enter a Formula One Grand Prix. Now, early in this presentation, I mentioned Grand Prix racing had become much bigger in Europe in the 1930s. Formula One was evolved out of that early pre-war Grand Prix racing. Formula One initiated a rule set that would dictate what the cars were able to do in a race and created a schedule by selecting a handful of the very best, most prestigious Grand Prix in the world. This was a very male-dominated field. Grand Prix racing was, post-war Formula One was, but there was one woman who managed to break in quite early, and that's Maria. She was born to an Italian count in 1926. She was the youngest of 5 children, and she grew up an avid fan of all things sport. In the late 1940s, she got her first taste of speed. Her 2 older brothers teased her and said, "There's no way you can go faster behind the wheel of this car than we can." She got behind the wheel, she went faster, and she fell in love. She entered a distance race between 2 cities in Italy, entered her first championship in 1954, and became second place in the Italian Sports Car Championship. Her success drew the eye of a major Italian manufacturer named Maserati, who hired her as a works driver. Being a works driver was a big deal. That means the team is paying you perhaps a salary for racing. They are paying to prepare, develop, and fix your car. So you just basically have to show up. Now, she's not racing in Formula One at this point. This is sports car racing. But by the time she gets her experience, she thinks she's ready to move up to the big leagues. Maserati has pulled out of Formula One. They are no longer racing. But in 1958, they were still offering their cars, their outdated cars, for any interested folks who might want to race them. Maria got her hands on one of these cars and entered it in the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix. Now at this time, safety usually dictated a certain number of cars were allowed to start the race, but you would have more people enter than could start that race. So you had to qualify for the event. Maria did not qualify. She was undeterred. She packed up, she drove out to Belgium, and she started her first Formula One Grand Prix. She qualified for it and finished 10th. She raced in 2 more events that year, qualified for both of them, retired from both of them with car trouble, but she could have done more. The problem was that many organizers, they could set their own rules for anything like how much prize money they were willing to offer to who actually was allowed to compete in these series. And they didn't let women in. Some racers' organizations did, some didn't. And as Maria remembered later in her life, the organizers at the French Grand Prix told her the only helmet a woman should wear is at the hairdressers. So she moves on, 1959, joins Behra Porsche, a sports car and Formula 2 team, but then retires from racing halfway through that season. Her team leader, Jean Behra, is killed in an accident at the German Grand Prix, and she's devastated. She never got behind the wheel after that again, but she did pave the way for the next woman who entered Formula One, Lella Lombardi. And Lella remains the most experienced woman to have competed in Formula One and the only woman to have scored any points in Formula One. Lella's upbringing was much different than Maria's. She was born to a working class family, and she learned to drive because her father had a delivery van for his butcher business, and he needed his kids to drive it. She got started professionally racing after she got tired of trying to set quicker and quicker lap times between two distances between her delivery route. She moved from go-karting to open-wheel racing, which is where the wheels and the driver's head are exposed. And she entered her first Formula One race in 1974. Did not go well. She did not qualify, but she caught the attention of a gentleman named Count Vittorio Zanon. Count Vittorio Zanon owned the Lavazza Coffee Company. They got to chatting over the winter, and he was impressed by the fact that Lella was so willing to go out there and compete in a male-dominated world. So he said, "I'll give you some sponsorship if you can find a team to field you." Lella inked a deal with a little British manufacturer, well, a British team called March. Ferrari is probably the prototypical Formula One team, and those teams not only built their own cars and engines, but they were also road car operations, so they had a whole lot of capacity. March purchased pre-made components from other manufacturers and pieced them together. Often would kind of create their own body and chassis sometimes, but the engine, the gearbox, those things were outsourced. March quite enjoyed signing young drivers, drivers who could come with little experience but a whole lot of money. And Lella was one of those drivers. Unfortunately, March was not a top-level team because of that. So Lella would go out to practice, she would do fine. She'd come back into the pits and she would suggest changes. In particular, this car that she was driving handled like a monster. She couldn't keep it on the track. And she didn't think that was her fault. She had a specific reason. She thought something was wrong with the chassis or the bulkhead. The team did not believe her. They did not listen to her. And in fact, did not even bother to look at the car until 1976 after she had left and a driver named Ronnie Peterson got behind the wheel and reported the same problems. They discovered a crack in the bulkhead that was causing the car to shift wildly while she was driving, especially under acceleration. But her career by that point had pretty much wrapped up. Now, she did become the first woman to score points in Formula One. She did so in 1975. This is a record that does not come without its own tragedy. The reason she scored points, she was in 6th place, the final points paying position, when the Spanish Grand Prix was ended prematurely. There was a crash, 4 spectators were killed. The race was called off at this point. There was almost a boycott by the drivers prior to the race, pointing at the dangerous conditions of this racetrack, and it proved to be the case. Because she did not complete a full race, because these drivers didn't, they were awarded half points. So Lella would have gotten 1 point for finishing in 6th in a full race, and instead received a half point for finishing. Her F1 career ended shortly after. She went to endurance racing before she passed away of breast cancer. But I do want to highlight one other thing, because Lella is the first openly queer person to compete in Formula One. She and her partner Fiorenza were readily available at racetracks all across Europe. We're still in an era where that's not necessarily acceptable in Formula One. Many of the drivers who have come out have done so after retirement. Lella was actively queer during her career. So she was not only paving the way for women, but also for members of the LGBTQ+ community. It is finally time to turn to American motorsport. We've kind of neglected that, and that's because women weren't really encouraged to compete in racing in the United States. We didn't have those city-to-city races that were easy to enter. So it wouldn't be until we had a woman here named Shirley Muldowney in the drag racing world to come along and really push the envelope. Shirley fell in love with motorsport because she and her boyfriend, Jack, grew up in Schenectady, New York, street racing. It was a hobby for a lot of folks at this time. A lot of teenagers loved to get behind the wheel and drag race their buddies at every stoplight they could find. Shirley, she and Jack get married. She's 16, he's 18. He's a master mechanic, she's a driver. They make a great pairing because he's building her cars and she's taking them out to race. Now, the cool thing about drag racing is that anyone can do it. I can go take my little Mazda out there right now and I can go drag race if I wanted to. And if I worked up to the top ranks, the top rank is called Top Fuel Dragster Racing. These cars get to over 350 miles per hour. The whole goal is to be the fastest person over a quarter mile, whether you're going 60 miles per hour or 300. So Shirley, she had an easy kind of entry. It was okay that women competed. This was a fairly amateur sport. And she went to her first professional drag strip in 1958, then earned her first professional license in 1965. She was a great competitor. She did well. She impressed everyone who raced against her. But when she was ready to move up to Top Fuel Racing, the pinnacle of drag racing, the NHRA, which sanctions this form of motorsport, denied her license. She was a woman. There was no way a woman could go this fast, could sustain this pressure, could handle those speeds. They would have continued to deny her had her colleagues, her male colleagues, not vouched for her and wrote a letter to the NHRA to say, we've raced against Shirley. She's a fantastic racer. She's a safe racer. If you do not license her, you are missing out. As it turned out, the NHRA gives her her license in 1973, comes to enjoy the added publicity of a woman behind the wheel. So a lot of folks were turning up to see a woman going 300 miles per hour. Shirley went on to make history. In 1977, she became the first woman to win a Top Fuel drag championship. In 1980, she won her second Top Fuel championship. She is the first person in NHRA history to do so. Not the first woman, the first person. And in 1982, she won her third title. Again, first person to win 3 titles in Top Fuel drag racing. She retired in 2003 at age 65 after having gotten into a whole variety of crashes throughout her career. But her legacy still exists in the NHRA. It is the form of motorsport with the most women. If you go to an NHRA event today, you will find probably 5 women competing, if not more. And just last year, in fact, we had racer Leah Pruitt sit down with a handful of other women to hammer out kind of a new policy for the NHRA, which means that basically women who become pregnant partway through the year and withdraw from competition are not penalized. They will then, another driver will get behind the wheel of their car and they will share the title. They will not write her out of history, which had been the case before. So this is a groundbreaking policy in all of motorsport, the only one that exists, and we now have it in the NHRA. To stay in our American motorsport lane, we have Janet Guthrie. Janet Guthrie, her father was a pilot down in Florida, and as she once told me in an interview, I was born adventurous and insufficiently socialized, so she quite liked speed. She learned how to fly at a very early age. She ended up transforming that into a career in the aerospace industry. So she was one of the few women in her engineering and physics classes at the University of Michigan while she was attending college. And when she graduated, she moved to New York to get a job. As she was a little bored in New York, she missed flying. So she went out to go see about buying a plane. But as she looked at these planes, she realized the airspace over New York is so highly regulated that she's not going to be able to get out there and do barrel rolls. She can't do aerobatics. She can't do stunts. So what's the point? It's not going to be any fun. So she takes her money and buys a Jaguar XK120 race car instead. She was racing in a lot of SCCA amateur events at this time, hill climbs, gymkhanas, all kinds of smaller events, and she was doing well. That's because she's pouring all of her time and her money into racing. When she gets home from work, she's going to the garage, probably sleeping there that night, spending as much time as she can making this car better. But by 1975, she's getting a little older, she's realizing that she has made no provisions for her old age, as she likes to say. No house, no husband, no jewelry, nothing of value, basically, aside from her cars. She's about to retire when she gets a call from an Indy 500 team owner named Rolla Volstedt. Rolla Volstedt had been one of the initial men to adopt major technical changes in the Indy 500, so it made sense that he wanted to be the first man to field a woman in this race. She does so in 1976. She passes the initial tests that she has to undergo. But when she gets to Indy, she finds there's a whole other hurdle for her to accomplish, for her to jump over. And that's because the hallowed halls of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway banned women from the pits, from the paddock, and from the press box. You were not allowed in any place a man was if you were a woman because you were a distraction. That included wives, girlfriends, family members, and even female team owners who would have their own grandstands constructed outside of the male garage area to watch the race. Janet was not going to stand for this. A few years prior, a journalist had earned a restraining order against the track that allowed her to access these spaces, but it was just for her. When Janet turned up as a competitor, she was hard-pressed to convince anyone that she was actually a racer, that she should be let into the garage area. They were going to build her a garage outside of the all-male garages so that she could go there. Eventually, she convinces them because it's ridiculous. It is absolutely absurd that they would rather build her garage than let her into an existing one. When she did so, she found she was still not welcome. There were no bathroom or shower facilities for women, so at one point she's doused in gasoline, needs to clean off, and there is nowhere for her to go but the all-male facilities. So she has a man stand outside the door to make sure that no one will come in to harass her while she's doing so. Even the fans are not fans of women at this point. As she's walking down the pit lane at various racetracks, excuse my language, but the fans are screaming, "No tits in the pits," at her. She withstands this. 1976, she does not qualify for the Indy 500. She felt her car was too dangerous for her to attempt to make the race and declined, but she returned in 77 with Rolla Volstedt. She qualified 26th of 33 cars. She did retire quite soon in that race. She was out after 27 laps with a car failure, but she made history as the first woman to conquer this race. And she wasn't just limited to IndyCar and open wheel racing. She was the very first woman to qualify for the NASCAR Cup Series Daytona 500. She's the first woman to qualify for a super speedway race in NASCAR. Her best finish in the Cup Series was 6th place, which remains a record, albeit one tied with Danica Patrick. And she did it in an era where NASCAR seemed intent on discrediting her. At one point, they even invited Lella Lombardi and another female racer from Europe over, gave them the best equipment possible. In an attempt to discredit Janet Guthrie, they were going to say, these women came over here, did better than you who are racing here as much as you possibly can, so we should no longer have to give you a license. Eventually, during that race, they all retired, so there was no argument to be made afterward, but the case still stands. It was not a very hospitable environment. And shortly after this, Janet retires. She's gotten older, and she simply cannot find anyone to pay for her to go racing. So her career was done. But I do want to end my little segment on Janet Guthrie here with a quote from her that I think sums up just about everything I'm talking about in this presentation. "You can go back to antiquity to find women doing extraordinary things, but their history is forgotten or denied to have ever existed. So women will keep reinventing the wheel. Women have always done these things and always will." Our last star here in this post-war section is a woman named Michelle Mouton. Now, everyone we've talked about so far in this presentation has, in this particular post-war era, has raced on street courses or road courses, paved courses. Michelle Mouton was a rally driver, and rally drivers do not always race on paved courses. They race through the forest, on dirt roads, through the sand, through the snow. They're conquering kind of the natural environment in a way that the other gals in this presentation were not. Rally evolved from that city-to-city distance racing. It takes place over a course of several days, different stages. Your whole effort here is to try to be the fastest person through each stage. And the best woman to compete in rally, without question, is Michèle Mouton. She was born in France in 1951 and dropped out of law school because she had started becoming a co-driver for some of her male friends and fell in love with the art of racing. Now, co-drivers, they sit in the front next to the driver and they read out instructions. They let you know what's coming up on the road in front of you so you can avoid any big incidents that might come. Her father sat her down and said, "Michèle, if you really want to do this, you need to drive the car." So she did. She entered her first event in the World Rally Championship in 1974 and did so well that there were immediately unfounded rumors that she had an illegal engine. The organizers tore her car apart, decided actually this perfectly complies with the rules, she just happens to be very good at what she's doing, and she was allowed to continue. That year she also did very well, drew the eye of a lot of sponsors because she entered the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and at one point during this race, it's raining, and she is flying by the more experienced competitors. Her team is telling her to slow down, and she has no idea why, because she's doing just fine. She doesn't understand why these more experienced men have to slow down under the rain conditions. She's going to do how she's going to do it. So it drew a lot of eyes, one set of eyes being from Audi, the German manufacturer, who called her up to sign her in 1980. This came with a lot of criticism. There were a lot of folks who believed there were more qualified men out there who needed a ride from a top-tier team like Audi, so it was absurd that a woman be invited to race. Didn't matter. She still did pretty well, won a rally in her first season. And in 1982, she and a driver named Walter Roll spent the season neck and neck. She won 3 rallies that year and ultimately would come home second in the championship by about 10 points. She remains the woman with the best finish in any FIA-sanctioned racing series in the championship. Outside of the WRC, Michèle also competed in events like the Pikes Peak Hill Climb here in the United States, which is basically a 14,000-mile race up to the top of a Colorado mountain. The year she went, 1985, she won the event. She set the fastest time, and not only the fastest time, a new record to be broken after she left. Michèle continued to race with Audi, but Audi started to slowly pull out of professional racing. It was trimming down the events that it competed in. And in 1986, she retired after winning the German Rally Championship. Michèle is still involved in racing today. She founded a series called the Race of Champions, which pits some of the best drivers from every country against one another. And she is part of the Women in Motorsport Commission that is founded by the FIA to help understand how to get more women involved. Now, that post-World War II era, we saw a lot of changes. We have not had as many of those changes after that. I won't say we haven't had any major conflicts or ideological shifts, but it has all kind of built upon everything that has been set prior. Because of that, we've seen a steadier uptick in the number of women who compete in motorsport. So maybe we've had some more, not a ton, but more than we had in the past. But the one racer we need to talk about in this section is Danica Patrick. Danica was born in 1982 in Wisconsin to a working-class family. She picked up a love of go-karting. She won 3 World Karting Association Grand National Championships, then dropped out of high school in 1998 to move to the United Kingdom to try to make it to Formula One. Now, it is very expensive to race in the United Kingdom. It is a multi-million-dollar affair, and she ran out of money soon after. 2002, she moves back to the United States and enters a junior level on the way up to the IndyCar series, races, competes well, and in 2005, debuts in IndyCar proper. Right away, she looked like she was set for a bright future. She won Rookie of the Year that season for her best performance of a rookie. She also won Rookie of the Year at the Indianapolis 500, where she became the first woman in that event's history to lead laps, and where she looked set to even win the race when she ran out of fuel. She started and finished that race in 4th place, which is still a record for the best performance by a woman at Indy today. In 2008, she became the first, and so far the only woman, to win a major American open wheel race, which she did at the Indy Japan 300 at Twin Ring Motegi. Now, 2008 in American motorsport was a hectic year. There were 2 rival factions that were both about to go bankrupt and needed to join forces to stave that off. Those 2 rival factions each had set their own calendars for 2008, and this weekend in April, when Danica was in Japan, there were actually 2 races scheduled. They could not reschedule either of them. One was the Long Beach Grand Prix, which is still one of the best street course races in the United States. One was in Japan. They're not going to cancel the race in Japan. So the drivers split up. Some of the drivers went to Long Beach, some went to Japan. Danica was one of those 18 drivers to go to Japan. She qualified well. She managed to outdrive and out-strategize more experienced drivers like Scott Dixon, Tony Kanaan, and Dan Weldon. She even outraced Helio Castroneves in this race. She won. Now, a lot of folks wondered, what's next for Danica? Where is she going to go? What is she going to ascend to? She kept racing in IndyCar, but in 2010 started to diversify. She started to enter American stock car races. She started in ARCA and then worked her way up to the NASCAR Cup Series for her full-time debut in 2012. There, she made even more records. She became the first woman to get a pole position in the Cup Series. She's a woman with the most starts, laps led, and top 10 finishes in Cup history. She is the woman who finished the highest at the Daytona 500, and she is just one of 14 drivers to have led laps at the Daytona 500 and the Indy 500. Danica retired from full-time racing in 2018. She has since become a Formula One pundit and a podcaster. But for a lot of women, the legacy that Danica has left behind is complicated. Danica was never shy about her appearance. She liked to use her body as a marketing tool. That is her right to do so. The problem was it set a precedent. A lot of sponsors began to say, if you don't pose in a bikini, we do not have to give you any money. So a lot of gals who have followed in her footsteps have been frustrated. On top of that, Danica has been very open and honest about saying the reason she left IndyCar to go to NASCAR was to make money. A lot of folks look down on that. She kind of left her skill behind in pursuit of a paycheck, and that therefore proves she's not a real racer and that women are gold diggers. There's a lot of arguments here that folks like to make. But regardless of how you feel about any of those things, the fact that Danica could make these choices, could do these things, is a win in and of itself. It means we have made steps forward for women in motorsport. Now, we've gone through all these women in history, and if you tune into a race today, anything but the NHRA basically, you will see that there are no women. So where do we go from here? What's next? There are now countless organizations that work to change things. The FIA, as I mentioned, has the Women in Motorsport Commission that's designed to study the ways that women are involved in racing and how to keep them involved. We have teams like the Iron Dames who have since this year folded, but not only fielded all women, but became kind of a rallying cry for female fans to say, this is a team that I can support even if I know nothing else about racing. We have Women in Motorsport North America and Shift Up Now, 2 organizations that offer scholarships for aspiring female drivers. But I think the biggest one we have to talk about is F1 Academy. Between go-karting and Formula One, there are several rungs of what we call a junior open wheel ladder. And as you get older and gain more experience, you move up from one rung to the next. But a lot of young girls never make it to the ladder. They drop out of go-karting. because around this time when they're 8 to 15 years old, girls in all STEM fields kind of start to turn away from those STEM fields for more interest in other socially acceptable female-coded hobbies. So these girls, maybe they've done go-karting for a few years. It costs a lot of money to move up to an open-wheel race car, and they drop out. F1 Academy is designed to be that first step. It is an all-female racing series founded by Formula One. Each Formula One team is required to field a female driver in the series, which means they have to sign that driver to their driver development program. Teams like McLaren have made history in the past few years by signing their first ever woman to any of their teams in any capacity ever. And it allows these girls to get some critical experience behind the wheel of a race car when they otherwise may have dropped out. The winner gets a couple $100,000 in prize money. There are open wheel championships that will help facilitate teams to field the top 3 performers in the F1 Academy Championship. So the whole goal is getting these girls in here, getting eyes on them. We can't really say if it's a success or not. It's just started. We won't know if it gets a woman to Formula One for probably another decade. But at the very least, we are seeing ongoing efforts to involve women in motorsport in ways they have never been included before. But that is all from me today. Thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.